Captain Maria Rodriguez felt the A-10 Warthog's engines screaming as she fought the controls. The aircraft shuddered violently, warning lights flashing red across her dashboard like angry fireflies. Below her, the sprawling military base of Fort Riverside stretched out across the Texas desert, its runways looking impossibly small from her damaged cockpit. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Eagle 7 requesting emergency landing." She called into her radio, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The response crackled back immediately. "Eagle 7, this is Tower. You are cleared for emergency landing. Runway 27 emergency crews are standing by." Maria's hands moved with practiced precision across the controls, but she could feel the aircraft losing altitude faster than she wanted. The left engine had taken shrapnel from the training, exercise gone wrong, and hydraulic fluid was leaking everywhere. She had maybe one chance to get this right. On the ground, a small crowd had gathered near the runway. Most were ground crew and maintenance staff, but she could see some of her fellow pilots among them. Captain Jake Morrison stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head. Beside him, Lieutenant Tom Bradley was already smirking. $20 says she prangs it," Bradley muttered to Morrison. "You're on," Morrison replied. "Rodriguez thinks she's hot stuff, but bringing in a damaged Warthog solo, that's suicide." Staff Sergeant Lisa Hayes frowned at the two men. "She's one of our best pilots," she said quietly. "Best?" Morrison laughed. "She's been here 6 months, and thinks she owns the place. Flying solo missions, always trying to prove something. Real pilots work as a team." The Warthog was coming in fast, maybe too fast. Maria could see the runway rushing up to meet her, and she pulled back on the stick, trying to bleed off speed without stalling. The aircraft responded sluggishly, like a wounded bird trying to stay airborne. "Come on, girl," she whispered to the plane. "Just a little more." The crowd on the ground held their breath as the A-10 touched down hard, bounced once, then settled onto the runway with a screech of tires. Sparks flew from the left landing gear as Maria fought to keep the aircraft straight. For a moment, it looked like she might lose control entirely. Then, gradually, the Warthog began to slow. Maria applied the brakes carefully, feeling the damaged aircraft respond. The plane rolled to a stop just short of the runway's end, smoke rising from the overheated brakes. The emergency crews rushed forward as Maria shut down the engines and popped the canopy. She pulled off her helmet and climbed down from the cockpit, her legs slightly unsteady after the harrowing flight. "Nice flying, Captain," called out Chief Master Sergeant William Foster as he approached. Foster was old school, a 30-year veteran who had seen everything the Air Force had to offer. "Thank you, Chief," Maria replied, running her hand through her short black hair. "The bird's going to need some work." Behind Foster, she could hear the snickers and whispers from some of the other pilots. Morrison's voice carried clearly across the tarmac. "Lucky landing. Pure luck. Any real pilot would have known better than to take off solo in the first place." Maria's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She had been flying since she was 16, had graduated top of her class from the Air Force Academy, and had more combat experience than half the pilots on this base combined. But she was still the outsider here. Still the woman who had transferred in from overseas operations to this comfortable stateside posting. Rodriguez, the sharp voice, belonged to Colonel Patricia Wells, the base commander. She strode across the tarmac with her usual nonsense bearing. "My office, 20 minutes. As the crowd began to disperse, Maria found herself alone with the damaged Warthog. She walked around the aircraft, assessing the damage. The left engine intake was peppered with holes, and hydraulic fluid had pooled beneath the wing. It could have been much worse. That was some flying. Maria turned to see Master Sergeant David Kim approaching. Kim was one of the senior maintenance chiefs, a quiet man who knew more about aircraft than most pilots knew about flying them. "The bird did most of the work," Maria replied. "The bird was dead in the water without a pilot who knew what she was doing," Kim said. "I've been working on A-10s for 15 years. I've seen plenty of pilots who couldn't have brought her in like that. Try telling that to Morrison and his fan club." Kim shrugged. "Morrison's got 20 hours in the Warthog and thinks he's Chuck Yeager. You've got actual combat time. There's a difference." Maria appreciated the support, but she knew it didn't change the reality of her situation. Fort Riverside was Morrison's base. He had friends here, connections, influence. She was just the transfer pilot who kept to herself and didn't play the social games that seemed so important to military politics. 20 minutes later, she sat across from Colonel Wells in the base commander's office. Wells was in her late 40s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of steady gaze that had intimidated junior officers for 2 decades. "Tell me what happened out there," Wells said without preamble. Training exercise, ma'am. I was running solo approach drills when the left engine started throwing warnings. Bird strike, looked like took some foreign object damage to the intake. You were flying solo? Yes, ma'am. Squadron commander approved solo training flights for qualified pilots. Wells nodded slowly. And you felt you were qualified for solo operations? I have over 2,000 hours in the A-10, ma'am. 800 combat hours. I was qualified for solo operations at my previous posting. Your previous posting was different, Captain. This is Fort Riverside. We do things differently here. Maria felt the familiar sting of being judged before she had even proved herself. Ma'am, I followed all established procedures. The emergency was handled by the book. The emergency, yes. But the circumstances that led to the emergency might have been avoided if you had been flying with a wingman. Ma'am, bird strikes can happen whether you're flying solo or in formation. In fact, flying in tight formation can increase the risk. If one aircraft takes a strike and Captain Rodriguez Wells interrupted, I'm not questioning your technical knowledge or your flying ability. What I am questioning is your judgment in choosing to fly solo training missions when you're still the new pilot in the squadron. Maria bit back her first response. She had been flying combat missions when most of these pilots were still in flight school, but pointing that out would only make things worse. Understood, ma'am. Good, you're grounded, pending a full investigation of today's incident. You'll be assigned to ground duties until further notice. Ma'am, with respect, I'd like to request. Request denied, Captain. That will be all. Walking back to the squadron building, Maria could feel the eyes of her fellow pilots on her. Morrison was holding court near the operations desk, probably regaling everyone with his expert analysis of her lucky landing. Lieutenant Bradley was nodding along, hanging on every word. The only person who met her eyes was Staff Sergeant Hayes, who gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maria gathered her flight gear and headed for her quarters. Tomorrow she would be stuck behind a desk, while the real pilots went flying. It wasn't the first time she had been sidelined because she didn't fit in, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But as she walked past the flight line, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The bird strike had felt different somehow, more deliberate than random. And the way Morrison had been so quick to bet against her successful landing, she pushed the thought away. Paranoia wouldn't help her situation. What she needed was to keep her head down, do her ground duties, and wait for the investigation to clear her. Then maybe she could start rebuilding her reputation at Fort Riverside. What she didn't know was that the investigation would uncover something far more dangerous than equipment failure, and by the time the truth came out, her ability to land a damaged aircraft would be the least of anyone's concerns. The next morning, Maria found herself assigned to a desk in the squadron's administrative office, surrounded by filing cabinets and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. Her temporary supervisor was Captain Jennifer Walsh, a career administrative officer who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by paperwork. Rodriguez, I need you to update these pilot qualification records, Walsh said, dropping a stack of folders on Maria's desk. Cross-reference everything with the training database and flag any discrepancies. It was mind-numbing work, but Maria dove into it with professional focus. As she worked through the files, she began to notice patterns that troubled her. Several pilots had qualification stamps for training they had never actually completed. Others showed flight hours that didn't match the aircraft maintenance logs. By lunchtime, she had identified at least a dozen serious discrepancies. She took her findings to Captain Walsh. These records don't add up, Maria explained, spreading the folders across Walsh's desk. Morrison shows 200 hours of night training, but the maintenance logs show his assigned aircraft was grounded for repairs during half of those supposed flights. Walsh glanced at the papers nervously. Maybe it's just paperwork errors. You know how these things get mixed up. This isn't mixing up serial numbers, Maria insisted. This is systematic falsification. Bradley here shows completion of high-altitude training that never happened. And look at this, Captain Rodriguez, Walsh interrupted, her voice sharp, with warning. I think you're reading too much into some clerical mistakes. Why don't you focus on just updating the contact information for now? Maria stared at her supervisor. Walsh's hands were actually shaking as she gathered up the folders. Ma'am, these aren't clerical mistakes. These aren't clerical mistakes, Walsh said firmly. Stick to your assigned duties. That afternoon, Maria tried to concentrate on the mundane task of updating address changes, but her mind kept returning to what she had discovered. False training records weren't just paperwork problems, they were safety issues. Pilots who claimed qualifications they didn't have were dangerous to themselves and everyone around them. During her dinner break, she decided to take a walk around the base. The evening air was cool and helped clear her head. As she passed the maintenance hangar, she noticed the lights were still on. Through the open doors, she could see Master Sergeant Kim working on her damaged A-10 evening. "Sergeant," she called out as she approached. Kim looked up from the engine he was examining. "Captain, how's the desk duty treating you?" "Could be worse. How's she looking?" "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Kim said, setting down his tools. "This wasn't a bird strike." Maria felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Kim led her around to the damaged engine intake. "Bird strikes, leave feathers, blood, biological material. This was clean metal damage. And look at this pattern." He pointed to the holes in the intake. "These are too uniform, too precise. This looks like shrapnel damage." "Shrapnel from what?" "That's the million-dollar question. I've been over every inch of this bird." "Someone sabotaged your aircraft, Captain. The question is who and why." Maria stared at the damaged engine, her mind racing. "Have you reported this?" "I called the maintenance officer this morning. Got told it was a bird strike and to process it through normal channels. When I pushed back, got told to stick to my job and not speculate. This is evidence of sabotage. They can't just ignore. They can, and they are," Kim interrupted. "Captain, I've been in the Air Force long enough to know when people don't want to hear something, but I thought you should know." That night Maria lay awake in her quarters, staring at the ceiling. Someone had deliberately damaged her aircraft. The question was whether they had intended to cause an emergency landing or something worse, and the way her supervisors were shutting down any investigation suggested. This went higher than just one person with a grudge. The next morning brought more troubling discoveries. As she continued working through the pilot qualification records, she found evidence of an entire system of falsified training. It wasn't limited to Morrison and Bradley, at least half the squadron had questionable records. When she tried to discuss her findings with Captain Walsh again, she was transferred to a different duty station. Her new assignment was inventory control in the supply warehouse, as far from sensitive flight records as possible. The warehouse was managed by Technical Sergeant Robert Franklin, a career supply specialist who treated every missing bolt like a personal affront. "Rodriguez, right? Heard you bent a bird the other day," Franklin said as he showed her to her workstation. "The aircraft sustained damage during a training flight." Maria replied carefully. "Yuan Chung, well, down here we try to keep things simple. Count inventory, update computers. Don't ask too many questions. Think you can handle that?" The message was clear. Keep your head down and your mouth shut. But Maria couldn't let it go. During her lunch break, she used one of the warehouse computers to access the base personnel files. What she found there made her blood run cold. 3 pilots had died in training accidents over the past 2 years. All 3 had been transferred to Fort Riverside from other bases. All 3 had been flying solo when their aircraft went down, and all 3 had been listed as pilot error in the official reports. Captain Susan Martinez, transferred from overseas operations, killed when her A-10 crashed during a routine training flight. Pilot error due to spatial disorientation. Major Robert Jackson, transferred from combat operations, died when his aircraft suffered catastrophic engine failure. Pilot error due to improper emergency procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Williams, transferred from a command position, killed when her aircraft broke apart during high-G maneuvering. Pilot error due to exceeding aircraft limitations. 3 experienced pilots, all transfers, all dead within months of arriving at Fort Riverside, and now someone had sabotaged her aircraft. Maria printed out the accident reports and studied them carefully. The pattern was unmistakable. Experienced pilots were being transferred to Fort Riverside, then eliminated in training accidents that were blamed on pilot error. But why? The answer came to her as she looked at the falsified qualification records again. Someone was running a systematic operation to eliminate experienced pilots while covering up the true qualifications of the remaining squadron members. But the scale of it suggested involvement at the highest levels. That evening, she tried calling the Air Force Inspector General's office from her quarters. The call was blocked. She tried using her personal cell phone. Same result. Someone was monitoring her communications. She was trapped on a base where experienced pilots were being murdered and the survivors were being silenced. And now that she had discovered the pattern, she was probably next on the list. The next morning, she reported for her warehouse duty as usual, but she had made a decision. She couldn't trust the official channels, and she couldn't leave the base without permission. but there was one person who might be able to help her get word to the outside. Staff Sergeant Hayes worked in the base communications center. If anyone could get a message out without it being detected, it would be her. But approaching Hayes would be dangerous for both of them. That as Maria worked through another day of mindless inventory counting, she began planning her next move. She had evidence of sabotage, falsified records, and a pattern of suspicious deaths. What she needed was a way to get that evidence to someone who could act on it. What she didn't realize was that her time was running out. The people responsible for the previous deaths had already noticed her interest in the accident reports, and they were preparing to add her name to the list of pilot error fatalities. The only question was whether she would figure out how to expose them before they could eliminate her. On her fourth day of warehouse duty, Maria noticed something that made her heart race. A shipment manifest showed deliveries of specialized aircraft parts that didn't match any of the planes stationed at Fort Riverside. The parts were for F-16 Fighting Falcons, but the base only operated at 10 Warthogs and a few training aircraft. She cross-referenced the serial numbers with the master inventory database. According to the records, these F-16 parts were being shipped to a classified maintenance facility designated only as Site 7. But Site 7 didn't exist on any of the official base maps. During her lunch break, Maria took a long walk around the perimeter of the base. In a remote corner, hidden behind a row of abandoned buildings, she found what she was looking for: a heavily guarded compound with no official designation, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. Through the gaps in the fence, she could see aircraft hangars and what looked like a runway. But these weren't the kind of facilities that appeared on any public base tour. "You lost, Captain." Maria spun around to find Colonel Morrison approaching, flanked by 2 security personnel. Morrison was Jake Morrison's father, a career officer who had been stationed at Fort Riverside for over a decade. "Just taking a walk, sir," Maria replied, keeping her voice steady. "This area is off-limits to non-essential personnel," Morrison said coldly. "I suggest you stick to the approved recreation areas." As they escorted her back toward the main base, Maria's mind was working furiously. The Morrison name on 2 members of the same squadron wasn't a coincidence, and the security around Site 7 suggested something far more serious than training accidents that evening. She made a decision that would change everything. Using her administrative access to the warehouse computer system, she began downloading every file she could access: shipping manifests, personnel records, aircraft maintenance logs, accident reports. Everything went onto an encrypted thumb drive she had hidden in her personal effects. The process took most of the night. She had to be careful to avoid triggering any security alerts, accessing files in small batches and covering her tracks. By dawn, she had assembled a comprehensive picture of what was happening at Fort Riverside. The evidence was damning. Site 7 was being used to maintain and operate aircraft that officially didn't exist. The F-16 parts were supporting a fleet of modified fighters that were being used for illegal operations. And the pilots who had died weren't victims of training accidents. They were experienced aviators who had discovered the truth and been silenced. The falsified qualification records served a dual purpose. They allowed unqualified pilots to appear legitimate on paper, while ensuring that any real pilots who might investigate were isolated and eliminated. But the most shocking discovery was the scope of the operation. According to the financial records she had accessed, Site 7 was generating millions of dollars in revenue from undisclosed military contracts. Someone was using Fort Riverside as a front for private military operations. Maria now understood why her aircraft had been sabotaged. She was an experienced pilot with a clean record and a reputation for asking questions. In the normal course of her duties, she would eventually have discovered the discrepancies in the squadron records. Rather than risk exposure, someone had decided to eliminate her in what would appear to be a training accident. The problem was that she had survived, and now she knew too much. As she prepared for another day of warehouse duty, Maria made copies of the most critical files and hid them in her personal belongings. She also wrote a detailed summary of her discoveries and sealed it in an envelope addressed to the FBI field office in Dallas. Her plan was simple: find a way to get Staff Sergeant Hayes alone and ask her to mail the envelope off base. Hayes seemed trustworthy, and as a communications specialist, she would understand the importance of getting the information to the right authorities. But when Maria arrived at the warehouse, she found Technical Sergeant Franklin waiting with new orders. "Rodriguez, you're being transferred again," Franklin announced, handing her a set of papers. "Report to the motor pool for vehicle maintenance duty." Maria scanned the transfer orders quickly. The motor pool was even further from any sensitive information, and the supervisor was listed as Master Sergeant Tony Kellerman, another name she recognized from the falsified qualification records. Sergeant Franklin, can I ask why I'm being moved again? Franklin shrugged. Orders from above. They need someone in the motor pool, and you're available. Not my call. As Maria walked toward the motor pool, she realized that her investigation had been noticed. Someone was systematically isolating her from any position where she might access additional information or contact potential allies. The motor pool was a large, noisy facility filled with military vehicles in various stages of repair. Master Sergeant Kellerman was a large, intimidating man with oil-stained hands and a permanent scowl. So you're the hotshot pilot who pranged the Warthog, he said by way of greeting. Down here, we work with our hands, not our egos. Think you can handle that? I'm here to do whatever job needs doing. Sergeant, Maria replied. Kellerman assigned her to cleaning and maintaining a fleet of Humvees. It was physically demanding work that kept her busy and isolated, but it also gave her time to think about her next move. During her second day in the motor pool, she overheard a conversation between two mechanics that made her blood run cold. Yeah, they're planning another training accident next week. One of them was saying, word is, it's that new pilot who's been asking too many questions. Same deal as the others. Sounds like it. Solo flight, mechanical failure, pilot error. Clean and simple. Maria felt her hands trembling as she continued working on the Humvee she was assigned to. They were planning to kill her, and they were discussing it openly because they assumed she posed no threat. That afternoon, she volunteered to deliver some repaired vehicles to various locations around the base. The job gave her freedom to move around and observe the base layout more carefully. More importantly, it gave her a chance to locate Staff Sergeant Hayes. She found Hayes in the base commissary during the dinner hour, sitting alone at a corner table. Maria approached carefully, making sure no one was watching. Sergeant Hayes, could I speak with you privately? Hayes looked up, surprised. Captain Rodriguez. I heard you were working in the motor pool now. It's a long story. Could we take a walk? They left the commissary together and walked toward the base chapel, a quiet area where they were unlikely to be overheard. Sergeant, I need your help with something important, Maria began. I have information that needs to get to authorities. Off base, but my communications are being monitored. Hayes stopped walking. Captain, what kind of information? Maria took a deep breath and decided to trust her instincts. Evidence of murder, fraud, and illegal military operations. 3 pilots have been killed to cover up what's happening here, and I'm supposed to be next. For a long moment, Hayes said, nothing. Then she nodded slowly. I've been wondering about those training accidents, she admitted. Too many experienced pilots dying in stupid ways, and the communication restrictions on certain personnel. I've noticed things. Will you help me? What do you need? Maria handed her the sealed envelope addressed to the FBI. This needs to get mailed off base without going through military postal channels. Can you do that? Hayes took the envelope and tucked it inside her jacket. I have friends in town. I can get this mailed first thing tomorrow. Thank you. But Sergeant, you need to be careful. If they figure out you helped me, let me worry about that. Captain, you just stay alive long enough for the cavalry to arrive. As they walked back toward the main base, Maria felt a mixture of hope and dread. She had finally gotten her evidence into the hands of someone who could act on it, but she also knew that her time was running out. The people running the illegal operation at Site 7 had killed 3 times to protect their secret. They wouldn't hesitate to kill again. What she didn't know was that Colonel Morrison had been watching her movements through the base security cameras, and he had already scheduled her final training flight for the following afternoon. The next morning, Maria was surprised to receive orders reporting back to flight status. The investigation into her emergency landing had been officially closed, and she was cleared to resume flying duties. Captain Walsh delivered the news with what seemed like genuine relief. Congratulations, Captain. The review board found no evidence of pilot error in your emergency landing. You're back on the flight schedule starting today. Maria felt a chill, despite the warm morning air. After days of trying to isolate her from sensitive information, suddenly she was being rushed back into the cockpit. It felt like a trap. Her suspicions were confirmed when she saw the flight assignment. She was scheduled for a solo training mission that afternoon, flying a route that would take her over the most remote parts of the desert. The same type of flight that had killed the 3 previous transfer pilots. At the pre-flight briefing, Colonel Morrison himself was present, along with Captain Jake Morrison and Lieutenant Bradley. They were all smiles and congratulations about her return to flight status. "Rodriguez, glad to have you back in the air where you belong," Colonel Morrison said. "I know the past few days have been frustrating, but that's all behind us now." "Thank you, sir," Maria replied, studying the faces around her. Jake Morrison was barely containing his smirk, while Bradley looked like he was struggling to hide his excitement. "Your aircraft today will be tail number 847, Colonel Morrison continued. "Master Sergeant Kim's team has gone over her from nose to tail. She's in perfect condition." Maria nodded, but her mind was racing. Kim had discovered evidence of sabotage in her previous aircraft. If he had found 847 to be in perfect condition, either he had been forced to sign off on another sabotaged plane, or he was trying to send her a message. After the briefing, she made her way to the flight line. Aircraft 847 was parked in its usual spot, and Kim was waiting beside it with his maintenance clipboard. "She's all yours, Captain," he said formally. But as he handed her the clipboard, he pressed a small piece of paper into her palm. "Everything checks out perfectly." Maria palmed the note and signed the maintenance forms. As Kim walked away, she unfolded the paper discreetly. The message was brief but clear. "Engine will fail at 15 minutes. Emergency beacon disabled. Good luck." Her blood ran cold. Kim had discovered the sabotage but couldn't prevent it without exposing himself. He was giving her the only warning he could. 15 minutes into the flight would put her over the deepest part of the desert, miles from the nearest road. An aircraft with engine failure and no emergency beacon would be nearly impossible to locate quickly. By the time search and rescue found her, it would be too late. As she conducted her pre-flight inspection, Maria's mind worked frantically. Couldn't refuse to fly without evidence that would expose Kim, but flying meant certain death unless she could find a way to survive. What was planned? Then she remembered something from her combat experience. During her deployment overseas, she had learned to carry a personal emergency beacon as backup equipment. It was against regulations to fly with unauthorized electronics, but it had saved lives when official equipment failed. The beacon was still in her flight bag. She activated it and clipped it inside her flight suit where it wouldn't be visible. She also made another decision that might save her life. Instead of flying the assigned route, she would deviate toward a more populated area. When the engine failed, it was a court-martial offense to fly outside assigned boundaries. But being alive for a court-martial was better than being dead in the desert. That as she climbed into the cockpit of aircraft 847, Maria felt the weight of what was about to happen. Someone on this base had killed 3 pilots and was now trying to kill her. But this time, the target would be ready. She started the engines and ran through her pre-flight checks. Everything appeared normal, but she knew that was by design. The sabotage would be subtle, something that would cause catastrophic failure at the worst possible moment. "Tower, this is Eagle 7 requesting departure clearance," she radioed. "Eagle 7, you are cleared for departure. Have a good flight, Captain." There was something in the tower controller's voice that sounded like a farewell. Maria wondered how many people on the base knew what was really supposed to happen on this flight. She taxied to the runway and performed her final checks. The aircraft felt solid and responsive, but she knew that would change soon enough. "Eagle 7 rolling," she announced, and pushed the throttles forward. The A-10 accelerated down the runway and lifted off smoothly into the clear desert sky. For the first few minutes, everything was perfect. The aircraft handled beautifully, the weather was ideal, and the view of the Texas landscape was spectacular. Maria was counting down the minutes. 12 minutes, 13, 14, 14. At exactly 15 minutes into the flight, she felt the first vibration in the left engine. Within seconds, warning lights were flashing across her instrument panel. The engine was coming apart internally, just as Kim had predicted. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Eagle 7 declaring emergency," she radioed. "Left engine failure, attempting restart." The response from the tower was immediate but unhelpful. "Eagle 7, can you make it back to base?" Maria looked at her instruments. Oil pressure was dropping rapidly, and the engine was overheating. "Negative. Tower, I'm losing altitude fast. Going down in the desert." What she didn't tell them was that she was steering toward Highway 287, a major road that ran north of the base. If she could reach the highway, there would be witnesses and immediate rescue response. The aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control as the damaged engine created asymmetric thrust. Maria fought the controls, using every skill she had learned in combat to keep the plane airborne. At 5,000 feet, she made a decision. She could probably nurse the aircraft back toward the base, where it would crash in the empty desert. as planned, or she could aim for the highway and risk everything on a desperate gamble. She chose the highway. Eagle 7 to any station. I am attempting emergency landing on Highway 287, approximately 10 miles north of Fort Riverside. Emergency. Crews respond to Highway 287. The response from the tower was sharp and immediate. Eagle 7, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Do not attempt landing on a public highway. Tower, I cannot make it back to base. I am committed to highway landing. As she descended toward the ribbon of asphalt below, Maria could see traffic beginning to slow and pull aside. Someone on the ground must have spotted her distressed aircraft and called it in. At 1,000 feet. She heard something that made her heart stop. Another aircraft was approaching fast from behind her. She looked back and saw an F-16 fighter closing on her position. Unidentified F-16. This is Eagle 7 in emergency. Maintain safe distance. She radioed that there was no response. The F-16 was now flying formation with her, close enough that she could see the pilot's helmet, but the aircraft carried no military markings. Suddenly, she understood. The F-16 wasn't there to help, it was there to ensure she didn't survive her emergency landing. If she successfully landed on the highway where witnesses could see her, it would raise questions about why her emergency beacon hadn't worked. The unmarked fighter was probably going to strafe her aircraft as soon as she touched down, making it look like she had crashed and exploded on impact. But Maria had one advantage. She was flying an A-10 Warthog, an aircraft designed to survive combat damage, and she had a personal emergency beacon that was already broadcasting her location to search and rescue. As she lined up for her approach to the highway, she made a decision that would expose everything. Instead of landing cleanly and giving the F-16 an easy target, she would make her landing as dramatic and visible as possible. She aimed for a section of highway where several cars had already pulled over. As she touched down hard on the asphalt, she deliberately ground-looped the aircraft, spinning it sideways in a shower of sparks and smoke. The dramatic landing sent emergency vehicles racing toward the scene from multiple directions. Within minutes, the highway was swarming with police, fire trucks, and ambulances. The F-16 circled overhead but didn't attack. Too many witnesses, too many cameras. Instead, it disappeared to the south, heading back toward the unmarked facility at Site 7. As Maria climbed out of her wrecked aircraft, she found herself surrounded by first responders and curious civilians. Everyone was taking photos and videos with their phones, creating a permanent record of what had happened. But she knew this was just the beginning. She had survived the attempt on her life, but the people responsible were still in control of Fort Riverside, and they would be planning their next move. What she didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Hayes had already mailed her evidence package to the FBI, and that federal agents were already on their way to investigate the mysterious deaths at Fort Riverside. The final confrontation was still to come. Within hours of Maria's dramatic highway landing, the story was everywhere. Local news crews had arrived at the scene, and cell phone videos of the emergency landing were spreading across social media. The official Air Force statement claimed it was a routine training accident with no injuries, but the dramatic footage told a different story. Agent Patricia Mills of the FBI arrived at the hospital where Maria was being treated for minor injuries from the hard landing. Mills was a veteran federal investigator who specialized in military corruption cases. Captain Rodriguez, I received an interesting package in the mail yesterday, Mills said, showing Maria a copy of her evidence summary. Very detailed allegations about illegal activities at Fort Riverside. Agent Mills, I need to tell you about the F-16 that followed me down, Maria said. Someone tried to make sure I didn't survive that landing. We're already investigating that the FAA tracked an unauthorized aircraft in your vicinity at the time of your emergency. No flight plan, no radio contact, no identification markings. That's a serious federal crime. Over the next several hours, Maria told Agent Mills everything she had discovered. The falsified pilot records, the suspicious deaths, the evidence of sabotage, and the mysterious Site 7 facility. Mills listened carefully, taking notes and asking detailed questions. When Maria finished, the agent leaned back in her chair with a grim expression. Captain, what you've uncovered appears to be a massive fraud operation. Someone has been using Fort Riverside to provide fake credentials for unqualified pilots, probably for private military contractors. When experienced pilots like yourself threatened to expose the scheme, they were eliminated. What about Site 7? We're getting warrants to search that facility right now. but I suspect we'll find evidence of illegal aircraft modifications and unauthorized military operations. That evening, as Maria watched from her hospital window, she could see FBI vehicles arriving at Fort Riverside. The investigation was finally beginning. The next morning brought dramatic developments. Colonel Morrison had been arrested on federal charges of conspiracy and murder. Captain Walsh and several other officers were also in custody. Most shocking of all, the search of Site 7